Everybody, my name is Jenny Duong. I am the head of marketing at Viso Trust, and I will be moderating our live panel today. Thank you so much for joining. Today's topic is, can we shift left with third-party risk management? Now, we've got an incredible lineup of panelists today to discuss this topic, because obviously it brings up a lot of questions when you hear shifting left with security and TPRM. So many things come to mind. But our panelists today, they are seasoned and trusted security leaders, and I'll introduce them in just a moment. But before we get started, I just wanted to let the audience know that throughout the panel, we will be dropping in some audience polls, and I'll highlight them, occasionally. If you just have 2 seconds, please do, interact, click and respond to the poll. We'd really appreciate that information and your insights on that. So I'll get started right now. In terms of this topic, this kind of came up because, as Paul and many other security leaders have mentioned to me, we know that many companies are approaching an end state where 100% of their tech stack is actually owned by third parties or accessed by third parties. Today, we'll be exploring how the security leaders on this call approach challenges, strategies, and areas of innovations when dealing with third-party risk. So we hope that the audience will find a ton of insights, useful insights, and walk away from this panel with useful information and strategies that they can take into their own programs. So with that, I'd like to do a quick round of introductions. Panelists, if you can, introduce yourselves, where you are currently, and a little bit of background about your security experience. And I will kick it off to Paul first.
Hi, folks. Paul Valente, CEO and co-founder of Viso Trust. Prior to founding Viso Trust, I'm a longtime security professional. So I was the Chief Information Security Officer at Restoration Hardware and Lending Club and ASAP, some other companies as well. I've spent a lot of time on both sides of third-party cyber risk management, and really delighted to be part of the panel today. Thank you.
Hey folks, I'm Terry O'Daniel. Until recently, I was the head of security and GRC at Instacart, and I've just joined Amplitude, and I'm the head of security and GRC at Amplitude. Prior to Instacart, I started my career as a network engineer, and I worked mostly on the infrastructure and operational security side of the house for a long time. But I've spent the past 10 years focusing mostly on building engineering first risk and compliance and assurance functions at large enterprises like Yahoo and Salesforce and Netflix. And I've worked in third-party risk for a number of years, and I am always passionate about finding ways to help the business understand where a good perspective on third-party risk can help them make better decisions.
Hi, everyone. I'm Roman Brezina. I'm currently the head of security at Commure. Prior to this, I was the CISO at Carbon Black. So like Paul, I've had the privilege to work on both sides of the vendor and consumer side of third-party management. Prior to that, I was the CISO of Draper Laboratory, and then similarly, a longtime practitioner, having been a security engineer prior to making fateful decisions to go into management. This is now the third security program that I've been working to build from scratch. So the perspective really is around how do you get started? What do you deal with first, second, third? And how do you really go about building this in a way that works? So looking forward to the discussion, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, everyone. So I know that shifting security left, and shift left security tools have been a huge trend the last couple of years. But shifting left can mean a lot of different things depending on who you talk to. So in order to get a baseline, I'd like to ask our panelists, what does shifting left mean to you? And can you scope that down specifically to third-party risk? Where does it fit into TPRM? And I can kick that off to Terry first.
Sure. I think for me, shifting left is at the core of understanding that the end result of the work we do in engineering, which is code releases into production and running, sites, SaaS tools, platforms, etc., is not where the work begins. It's really an evolution of the thinking into pulling the human interactions between the business, product development, and engineering into the spotlight, so we have a better understanding of the fact that our risk profile and the risk discussions shouldn't begin when we do a merge or a pull request, or we put something in our CD pipeline, but rather they are further to the left of the entire software development lifecycle. For me, I think when we apply that and then or through the filter of third-party risk, the world has changed over the past 5 or 10 years. The prevalence of using cloud providers and SaaS providers for at the past 2 companies I've worked at, the vast bulk of our tools and our infrastructure, et cetera, were all cloud driven and SaaS driven. So the third-party risk profile of a company 10 years ago that ran its own data centers, had a lot of on-premise applications, ran its own infrastructure, et cetera, that's changed. Those are third-party relationships these days, and we need to incorporate the risk profile and the risk informed decisions we make when looking at a cloud-first infrastructure, a SaaS-driven architecture, and the prevalence of microservices and how all that tangled spaghetti web works together. We have to take that into account as we look through the lens of shifting left in our third and even fourth party relationships.
Great. Paul, Roman, do you have anything to add to that or your perspective on shifting left?
Yeah, I think when it comes to this specific topic of third parties, it's largely how do you accelerate helping deliver value for services, business applications within your company, right? So more specifically, shifting left really translates into how do you set things up that allow you to provide better self-service, right? So that everything isn't bottlenecked through security the way it tends to traditionally happen, but doesn't sacrifice requirements, right? And what does that look like, and how do you help do that? And the answers tend to vary whether you have dedicated resources, technology, automation, or none of the above. But yet, right, in my case, healthcare has compliance requirements. There are contractual obligations, right? No one really has the luxury to skip this, and the level of diligence you put into it really can make or break relationships and other outcomes. So it's really about how do you set this up and design this in a way that helps move security closer to the speed of SaaS and the business and expectations. Ultimately, again, to balance that trade-off between helping ensure someone's not sitting around waiting for a month to see value out of a new application or utility, but not saying that, yeah, we didn't actually look at what it does or what it needs. We just kind of approved it and move on, right? And don't have to make those sacrifices. So that's kind of where this leaves us.
And Paul, I think you're muted. I'm sorry.
Thanks for that, Jenny. I was saying, I love that answer, Roman. I think highlighting that the ability to keep up with business, perhaps even accelerate business, whereas a lot of times, even though we talk a lot about security as a business enabler, as CISOs, a lot of times our customers, don't see it that way, right? And so that's a really important point. One of the things I think about with regard to shifting left with third-party cyber risk management is ROI, really risk ROI on the process, right? Third-party cyber risk management can be a ton of work, and it doesn't always yield, meaningful results. And I think that being able to do it earlier increases the chance of those meaningful results. If you have enough time, you can influence vendor selection, right? Or you can perhaps, choose to have remediation in contract terms in some situations, or you might even be able to reconfigure how you're going to work with that third party if you need to. However, if you don't get the information that you need until after you're already doing business with the vendor, your ability to influence risk dramatically decreases, right? And so that brings us to, how do we do it fast enough, accurately enough, easy enough to scale to actually shift left, right? But anyway, that's kind of what it means from my perspective.
I appreciate that. So this kind of goes into, the other question that I wanted to ask the panelists here is, in talking about TPRM, there are a ton of challenges, be it political, be it budgets, be it lack of resources. What are the biggest challenges that you see with third-party risk management today, either in your org or, generally speaking, when implementing a strategy? And I will kick it off to Roman.
So one of the biggest challenges is, how do you obtain the information you need to make a risk-based decision from that third party, right? Because there's no universal standard for what vendors, companies provide. Every industry, every vertical, whether it's marketing software, HR software, IT software, cloud providers, they all have different things that they will provide up front. And ultimately, right, security professionals need to understand really two components, which is what is the profile of the vendor we're doing business with, and then what does the actual implementation of that specific technology that the business is looking to acquire look like, and is that going to introduce risk? And generally, there's a widespread of how easy or hard it is to get security information. I will say there's a positive trend that more and more companies are putting security pages on their websites. They're putting documentation that helps people understand the starting point. But the bottlenecks tend to always become, okay, what's required for the implementation? And do I know what's going to happen to our data, to our customers' data, once we hit approve? And the challenges really revolve around, right, how do we get that information that is not 100-question spreadsheet that someone has to fill out and getting on multiple phone calls, right, that drags out for weeks to get an answer of, yep, this is worth the ROI, to Paul's point, or no, this is really going to put the business in a bad place.
Yeah, I think that's great. I think, and you called out a challenge I would double down on. We are getting better, I think, as security organizations about building the workflows and investing in automation, hopefully, that gives us some of that data to make those risk-informed decisions. And it can be tough to find to strike a balance between simply having minimum barriers to entry, right? You must be this tall to ride this ride. Oh, you have a SOC 2, great, go to the front of the line. It's tough because we want to use automation and we want to have, we want to build a funnel so that humans can apply human intelligence to the smallest possible set of those risk decisions. But inherently, you have to build thresholds and you have to have those sort of move on to the next step or not kind of flow systems. And that it's tough to find a balance to do that in a risk-informed way rather than the sort of checkbox approach that we've seen be pretty unsuccessful when it comes to mitigating risk through compliance over the past decades, let's say. So +1 to that. I'd also call out that as a consumer, I love the just renaissance we're in of tools, and there's so many freemium options out there and low-cost options where I can just give someone a credit card and get started. But from a risk perspective, that makes it incredibly challenging because there's not necessarily a single procurement funnel that all of these tools are coming in through. And whether we call it shadow IT or boutique IT, I think the emergence of everything being in the cloud and there being so many tiers of options makes it really tough to take a command and control type approach to having a single view of where your third-party risks are.
That's, so right on there, Terry. And if there's one thing that I can, add to the great comments that both Roman and Terry added on this one, is this concept of scale, right? Jenny mentioned at the beginning, companies approaching 100% of their technology footprint being owned by third parties. And that, some companies, that means, hundreds of vendors, some it means thousands, some tens of thousands of vendors, right? And that means that if you are spending time getting information, just getting the information or doing a manual analysis, then you're wasting your time. You're not going to be able to scale that across the volume of vendors that you need to, right? You're not going to get coverage. You're not going to get the insights that you need to so that you can spend time having those conversations with business owners that are going to garner good business decisions based on risk, right? So scale is really important. Now, obviously, underneath scale, well, then I need to get accurate information really, really quickly, effortlessly, right? To be able to do that across thousands and thousands of vendors, right? Which means, vendors have to respond all the time, or I need an easy way to get that information, right? And so there's other challenges underneath that core scalability issue. But great comments, folks. Makes perfect sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And just to kind of continue on, because we have a ton of questions for the panel today, I'm going to move forward with the next couple of questions. And a reminder to the audience, we do have polls, so please do look through and, quickly click in and answer if you have a moment. Thank you so much. And I believe we have 2 poll questions, so they will be popping up. So my next question here is, we talk about automation, we talk about potential tools that we should be integrating. What challenges do TPRM solutions or tools bring? And more specifically, can you share, the solutions or tools that you've previously implemented? And then kind of a third point to that is, what happens post-implementation of these tools and processes?
I can take a first stab at this. And to reference some great comments in the chat, it's a delicate dance, because you want your stakeholders in various organizations engaged and involved. I definitely want contract legal and privacy legal to care deeply about the risk-based decisions we're making in security, because I usually wear the security and compliance hats. But it's not often the best fit if we start at the top of the funnel with some sort of procurement-based system and we try to build risk workflows into those systems, because that's not really what they're built to do. So I think that the tooling aspect, as someone called out, it would be great if BISO-Trust would just own the whole space and solve that problem for us. But the current state tends to be, we're working with CERTA or some sort of procurement tool. We have to find a way to get the inputs from our stakeholders into that tool to build some sort of rudimentary workflow. And at a certain point, I need to pipe out a subset of those vendors that I want us to do a deeper risk analysis on. And then I need to get that information back into the workflow of the tool. And it's better than, just manually meeting and talking through these issues, but those integrations can definitely prove a challenge.
So I can piggyback off of that. The challenges with tools, right, there's really 2 components to this. One is to the comment in the chat about the holistic, right, from a procurement process, and we will hold off on the comments that Perry made about people going out and putting things on a credit card, because unless people want to fund enterprise licensing personally, those are always going to get caught through finance at some point in time, just maybe not day one. But I don't know of a lot of people that want to fund companies personally. So those have a end result that you can address eventually. Just from a security perspective, you have to learn how to deal with that gap. But there is, right, what is the tooling and the workflow around procurement? And that has its own challenges of security being a stakeholder in that. All right, so what is the business constraints? What are the requirements? An easy example for that would be, hey, there's a tool that needs admin rights to all email. Business may not care because it's going to give them the functionality they need from a go-to-market perspective. Legal, privacy, and security might feel otherwise. How do you resolve that? You're not going to resolve that in a tool. So either you have standing boundaries for what's acceptable risk in the company, or you have a process that's going to involve stakeholders getting together, accepting what is the technical merits of it, the business value, and or what's going to go in the legal contract. And there's a whole security legal workflow that tools don't necessarily help solve. And that's ultimately where the challenge is. It's, to Terry's point, it's that process that the tools don't solve. They can get you the information faster, but that doesn't translate into a faster decision that necessarily helps shift things left when it comes to anything that is not a black and white, hey, okay, this is easy, it's minimal risk, vendors got their certifications, yeah, sign off on it and go. It's, no, this is going to have financial data, regulatory data, this is going to be part of future audits, we have to show due diligence. How do we get to the right answer of the business is willing to live with this and the right people are signing off on it versus not? And ultimately the tools today help get the information faster, but they don't help solve the actual decision making of who and where is making that risk and why.
So does that decision making and process need to be predetermined, internally? Does the data classification need to be decided upon? Like what is that cadence then before you bring in a tool to help you with some of the issues that you're experiencing?
I would only love for it to be that easy. I will say, this is where government, finance, healthcare have it slightly easier because there's very explicit bounds and restrictions and liabilities around regulated industries. Being in the technology space, far less so. It's whatever you and your customers want to contractually agree to, and what helps you provide your services. I would say it becomes circumstantial. There will be industries and businesses that can do that. And then you deal with the outliers, and then there will be situations where no, it's going to be much, much harder for anyone to have. We can always agree to these circumstances all the time, and we don't have to meet to review it. That's going to depend on largely what are the constraints of your vertical.
Yeah,
Paul, anything to add to that, or Terry?
I would agree that it is a challenge. As someone who works in the startup growth and pre-public space quite often, it's a moving target, right? We have a certain risk profile at a certain point in time when we're a startup, and then it changes as we become a growth company and we have larger enterprise customers. And then as we go public, we have certain obligations. Maybe we take on, we work in different markets, we expand to Europe, we have privacy considerations from GDPR. I think the challenge is it has to be an ongoing conversation, and we can't ignore the human element of getting those perspectives. Of all of those, I would say the regulatory and privacy piece is what keeps me up at night, because that's not my expertise, and I am heavily reliant on stakeholders in those spaces to inform proactively what our process needs to look like, where those guide rails or gates need to be.
So Jenny, I've spent a lot of time with different tools in this space. For instance, when I was back at Lending Club as the CISO there, having to solve a problem where we needed to scale this process very, very quickly, we tried workflow tools, which came from GRC providers or procurement tools that allowed us to put questionnaires online. We tried security ratings vendors. We tried exchanges, right? And what we saw was inaccurate results. We saw low vendor adoption, and we saw a ton of work, right? To boot, many of these solutions take an expert team to run, a long time to set up, sometimes professional services to set up, and so there's lots of challenges with these tools. To Terry's comments, this space requires automation, right? It requires integration. It requires automated decisioning on risk, in a way that is transparent and that aligns with your risk program, right? And your unique view on risk, right? And so it really takes a sophisticated solution, and it's a hard problem. Yeah.
Great. Thank you for that. Thanks for all of your feedback here. So this gets to kind of the crux. We've talked a lot about the challenges. So, in practice, I'd love to understand from your perspective, can we actually shift left with TPRM? And if so, what does that look like in an ideal place for you? And I will kick it off to Terry because he looks like he has something to say.
I have a stomach ache around this question, I think, more than anything else. I do believe so. And I do think it's the only path to sanity. I don't think we can focus on the last mile and hope to be successful in any way here. We have to get involved early. We have to be building that continuous feedback loop with stakeholders. We can and should automate parts of the process judiciously. And I think that's, maybe not to focus too much on the challenges piece, but I think that's an area where the emergence of free or freemium apps is a challenge that I think we need to continue to address and find a way to draw a line that makes sense for us. If we're if we work in certain industries like healthcare or fintech or et cetera, it might be a little easier to take a more, draw a bold line and say, this is allowed, anything else is not, kind of an allow list type of process. I think I'm used to working in organizations that are a little more fluid and fast paced in terms of they're still in their growth cycle, and they are willing to accept a high degree of risk. We may not have the best processes to document that risk acceptance, but I think it's sort of culturally ingrained to the idea that we're moving fast, we're breaking things. So I think there's an opportunity to pick your scope, right, and define what are you going to focus on first. Am I going to worry about the emergence of these Chrome extensions and sort of app-like services like, not to pick on anyone, but Grammarly? Am I going to give Grammarly access to every single thing I write? Am I going to let Superhuman manage my email for me and every little bit of internal conversations that we're having through that email? I do think you need to sort of pick your battles, and you need to align with your stakeholders, privacy, contract, legal, any other risk, people with a risk-based perspective. And you need to draw that line and say, hey, this is where we're starting. And we're going to start with this subset of apps and integrations, and we're going to have a really strong perspective on it. And I think once you've gone through the sometimes bare knuckle boxing, but the human struggle of defining what that means and how do we pull our business values and our business risk objectives into solving that problem, it gives you the opportunity to radiate out into those other spaces that are maybe the corner cases and things like that. That's what I found to be successful.
Roman, anything to add to what Terry had mentioned?
I think there's a reality that you can make progress shifting left by helping set proper expectations, right? So as I alluded to in the beginning, right, allow for a little self-service and don't make security bear the burden of everything required, and allow security to really just focus on answering the question of, should this risk be something we want to accept or reject for the company, and have the basis to do that, right? So what can you do? Can you let stakeholders know what the expectations are to introduce a new vendor, freemium or otherwise, right? Does it have MFA? Will it support single sign-on? Does it have audit logging, right? Will it do encryption? Bare minimum security fundamentals that they don't need to come to the security team for. And guess what? If you want to introduce something, you better have a hell of a strong case to be able to have anyone in the business justify why we're going to skip basic security controls in 2022, right?
Mhm.
And that allows folks to already have done diligence, already have gone through their own internal vendor selections before even engaging in this process, which means by the time they're coming to you, you know what the starting point is. We also have them bring us compliance reports, SOC 2, ISO, or otherwise, before they even engage in security, so that we have as much of the information as possible to shorten that review time. Because in any non-enterprise, you probably don't have a full FTE or multiple FTEs dedicated to just sitting around trying to process this, right? So it's a combination of how do you ensure the stakeholders have the right expectations and be part of the process to help make this better, as well as how do you then structure the automation, the security, to be able to then turn this around in a way that allows you the definitions of, yep, we want you to do this, go forth, or not, or, hey, there is a risk here. We need to all be on the same page of how we want to deal with it. I'll say that.
Yeah. And I'm curious, oh, go ahead, Paul.
Well, I was just going to say, well said, Roman, and Jenny, to answer your question, I absolutely believe that folks can and need to shift left. And our customers, many of our customers have done just that, and they've done that through automation. And I don't mean automation of questionnaires online. I mean essentially automating the collection of information using what vendors already have and producing automated risk decisioning that actually eliminates the work of due diligence. Essentially not just making it digital, but actually eliminating that work in a scalable way that gives them the insights they need to make good risk decisions up front. So I absolutely believe that we can shift left. And go ahead, Jenny. I know that you had a question.
Yeah, I was going to ask, for me, when I think about shifting left, I think it's a really easy thing to do if you're a growth company, a cloud or SaaS company, right? Does it look different to a large enterprise who already has existing GRC procurement platforms and processes? Like, how do you revamp those systems? Or is there a need to revamp? I mean, I think based off of the panel responses, it seems like there needs to be a continuous, look into our current policies and procedures.
I'll go ahead and jump in on that one, Jenny. So the way to apply it, to large, well-established organizations is essentially that they all have processes where they reassess vendors, right? And so essentially it just means, prior to the renewal or with enough time to impact the renewal in a way that puts them in a position to have some freedom to affect risk. Right? If it's just always going to be after the deals are signed, well, then it's an afterthought, right? Security is an afterthought. There's not going to be that much that can be done, but there's absolutely an opportunity. Also, those well-established companies are still bringing on new solutions, right? And so they can shift left. For most, it's a question of resources and cost, and that's because historically, it's been so inefficient and so costly to assess vendors. Which is obviously what solutions like ours solve for anyway.
Yeah, I love that. I love the fact that we're realizing, excuse me, that we need to do the work in-house first to define what sort of business we're in, what geolocations do we serve, what kind of industry are we in, and that informs the business risk profile that we build for our company. Before we assess a single vendor, we can do that work internally, working with our stakeholders to define what are our security standards. And then the work of assessing each individual vendor becomes a lot easier because we can sort of have a pass, fail, stop here, move to the next stage set of criteria, which to the question in the chat, I wouldn't say it's something we're pushing on to procurement so much as helping procurement build into their workflow what are the minimum bars to entry to get to a certain stage to be assessed, as opposed to letting everything just pipe through and then making it InfoSec's job to evaluate each vendor on a one-off basis. So I think it's the combination of having a position about your risk acceptance and your risk appetite, and how do you accept certain risks in the furtherance of business growth, and then using the automation to ensure that those decisions are happening as early as possible. But of course, the automation is not a panacea unless you've built those relationships internally and you've helped people understand the why. Why are we doing this? I promise we're not, it doesn't give us any like sick pleasure to turn people down when they're trying to get their apps to do business. We're trying to help the company assess risk and make risk-informed decisions. But you've got to do the internal evangelization of the why.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for noting that, Terry. I think being able to align with the business and business initiatives, as well as, you know, your senior leaders and getting everyone on board, internal stakeholders to be happy is, I think, a constant problem that a lot of security leaders are experiencing. So if there's anything we can do to alleviate that, I mean, this seems like an easier way to attempt that, right?
Right. And Jenny, you know, if we can do this up front, then the security requirements become business requirements, and it becomes part of the criteria for business owners to make good decisions. And then it frees security from being the department of no and the department of slow. Now you have business stakeholders saying, oh, I'm going to go with this solution instead of that one because they've got better security, right? And for me, you know, as a CISO, I wished that I would have had that at the time instead of becoming the department of no and the department of slow, despite all of our efforts otherwise.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Thank you for answering your questions here. I will move on. Just a heads up, audience, we do have another poll coming up. Thank you in advance for your patience. So I know that CISOs and security leaders don't live in a world of ideals. I know you do not like unicorns and rainbows, but more so live in a world of reality. But I'd love to hear from you, from each of you, you know, in a perfect world, what does your ideal TPRM program look like? And I'd love to see if there's any differences in terms of how you would approach your programs. Roman, I'm going to pick on you.
Oh, to play in the world of ideal.
Mm-hmm.
Infinite money, infinite resourcing. You know, what does that look like? What it ultimately looks like is continuous tracking and accountability of what is it we're trying to manage, right? To Terry's point, have we accounted for all the vendors? Do we know both what the vendors themselves and their profile looks like from a risk perspective, as well as what the solutions that they're providing? Can we make that big, bold line to say, yep, all of these vendors are below the sensitive criteria and they provide services, but we don't need to go into every single one of them at a implementation level versus, hey, these are all related to regulatory compliance requirements, and we have our own liability to show due diligence that we have reviewed them and we understand what's happening to the data. That's really hard to get to because of the imperfect information, constant criteria shifts, pressures we haven't talked about, you know, time sensitive. What happens when you're told, hey, we need to close this deal by the end of the week or we're not going to get the discount for quarter end? You don't have the luxury of time to go figure it out. You have to go make a snap decision with whatever information is accessible to you. Those are very real constraints that don't play in the land of ideal, that security doesn't always get the luxury of time or knowledge to make those recommendations on, right? And then there's a reality of, I would love ideally that if security makes a recommendation, somebody listens, because there's an awful lot of times that the business will say, yeah, that sucks. That's probably bad. We want it anyway. We're going to go do it. Thank you for your efforts. Which is not to say that we're not here to support the business. It's the fact that if there's a downstream impact, it's going to come back to security to manage that incident, deal with the mess. And you, in a world where ideally you could have prevented that, you haven't. I could probably go on. I'll just stop there.
Yeah, thank you for that. Paul, do you want to jump in on your ideal here?
Well, Jenny, I see this as, essentially the job of the CISO and the security team transforming, right? Security teams typically invest a lot in incident response and application security and various operational strategies for securing the data that's been trusted to them, right, by their customers. And what we're seeing is essentially, how do we replicate all those capabilities across populations of thousands of third parties, right? And so really having the transparency, having the automation to be able to do that. Now, obviously that's a tall order, but Roman mentioned some very important practical aspects, and I do believe that that solutions are getting there here, and I think it's very exciting. It's a very exciting challenge, and I see from the comments here that folks, the challenge certainly resonates with folks. Right? We are definitely wanting to empower business owners to have the information they need up front and to put security as to be able to put security as a first class criteria in the decision making process, which prior to their to their benefit they haven't been able to, because typically the data is only available like at the 11th hour before the contract is signed. It's like, well, what are they going to do? Do they really have an alternative that doesn't have equally realizable, if not more easily realizable, business risk associated with it, right? So the ideal allows us to balance security risk and business risk using the right information that's available at the right time.
Thank you, Paul. And Terry, how about yours?
Yeah, first I'd love to reference something Paul just said and tie it back to an earlier comment. Ideally, I think we would have an approved list of vendors. And I agree that I don't think the platform-based solutions for third-party risk have really delivered on the promise. I sure hope they were going to, but there's only so many vendors that meet our requirements at whatever our size and scale and our needs are. And it would be great if we could just go through those vendors and have a position or rely on a platform/library kind of solution that would give business owners an opportunity to say, oh, you're looking for an ERP. Here's the list of 3 approved ERP vendors. Go for it. If you want to use one of those, you're good. If you want to use something else, we're not going to block you, but there's a longer tail to getting that assessed and approved. So which leads me to my next point. I think the ideal state, and I feel a little embarrassed that I haven't done more of this myself. We talk a good game about risk in the security world, and we talk about, if only I could get risk owners to truly own their risks and to be pushing on me as the head of security to help them get their risk within an acceptable tolerance and things like that. But frankly, there's a lot else going on, and we're so focused on the right side of responding to incidents and monitoring vulnerability dashboards and things like that I don't know that we've done our best job of really shifting that part left and going to the business and saying, hey, you own these risks. We're here to help you and enable you, but these are business decisions about where we're willing to accept and absorb certain risks and where we're not. So should we be creating dashboards, not for us as CISOs and security leaders, but for those business risk owners? Yeah, we probably should. We probably should have that perspective that says, hey, financial systems team, here's your risk profile, and here's how it's changed based on certain vendors that you've decided to work with, and putting the onus on them, making it a business driver to get those risks within a certain tolerance that they have predefined with us, because as a business, we're, again, in a certain geographical area and we work in certain industries, and our customer relationships and our regulatory requirements demand certain things. For me, I think that's the true element of shifting left that I'll be honest that I tend to get stuck into the minutia sometimes of everything on the right side of the equation, and I don't, but I'm going to take some notes to do this, to really have that business alignment and to help the business understand where they are making good risk-informed decisions, and or where they're putting the entire company at risk based on those decisions.
Oh, yeah, that's definitely fantastic insights there, Terry and team. Thank you so much. So this kind of goes into, my final question for the panelists, and then we'll open it up to Q&A is, there are several folks in the audience who are either revamping their TPRM programs or they're just getting started on their TPRM or third-party risk journeys, right? What is the most impactful advice that you have for other security leaders or practitioners regarding third-party risk today? Paul, do you want to jump in?
Sure. I mean, I think there's some there's some security fundamentals at work here, right? So the first thing is understanding your environment, right? Your regulatory environment, your data, your business, right? And based on that, getting coverage of your third-party population. That first challenge is, who are all my third parties, right? And how do I invoke a model that's going to allow me to address that entire population in some way, right? And then come up with goals for your program. I think it's very important that you understand your program and its goals at a high level, and that you prioritize them. I think a lot of companies kind of jump in and say, oh, well, we're gonna implement a questionnaire and we're gonna start sending it out without thinking through the process or understanding really what they're embarking on, right? And most of those programs fail, frankly. 6 months in, they fail to scale, fail to gain accurate insights. They find that small numbers of vendors respond. So it takes getting that understanding, having goals, knowing what problem you're solving.
Thank you, Paul. Terry, what's your advice?
Yeah, I think Paul touched on something that I'd like to expand on, which is we were treating these as one-off decisions, and they're not. What we should be doing is investing in building an aggregate risk profile, and to Roman's point earlier, getting that continuous feed of data from whatever sources are available, and that should be constantly influencing our risk profile, and we should be able to report up to senior leadership, the board, the audit committee, whoever will listen, about how these decisions that we're treating as one-off choices are informing the overall company's risk profile. So I think that's incredibly important. And to pick one more tactical piece that I don't know that we've talked about very much, we've talked a lot about tools, but I will say every time I look at BPOs, business process outsourcers, it's like Pandora's box. And we realize that we've just signed these sweeping contracts, and then we look at it and we go, oh no, that's not great. Maybe we should wait for the next cycle and try to add some standards, which goes back to the earlier point of define those standards, working closely with your stakeholders to define them from business objectives, not just from security objectives, and then find a way to filter those into the contract signing processes, so that, again, you're not stuck in the last minute saying, sorry, I have to pull the brake here.
Great. Thanks for that insight and advice, Terry. Roman, anything to add to both what Paul and Terry had mentioned?
They did a fairly amazing job of covering it. I think the one really addition that I would have, right, is ensure you set clear definitions of what security will and won't do. Part of security reviews is stakeholders have a tendency to come up with their own expectations of what's acceptable, of what you can realistically do with the information you're given. And I think, to Paul's point about scale, regardless of whether you are in a enterprise or not, are you, from a security perspective, focusing your time and effort on the vendors and reviews that matter, or are you just trying to work through everything that comes through the funnel? right? Are there things that are part of the core of delivering your product, right, that interact with the data, that are going to be OEM'd in your solution, or that are core to your ability, right, to do customer support, things that literally drive the business. And if something happens there, oh, we have a much bigger problem, then okay, my plugin doesn't work. And I think you get so wrapped up in just trying to figure out how to work with procurement, how to turn through everything that comes through, that security tends to lose that focus of, are we spending the time on really the ones that are critical to the business? And if you don't know what that is, there's a good starting point to really say, hey, do I understand which vendors are critical? Because it's not the hundreds and thousands. You really can boil it down.
Great. Thank you, everyone, for your advice to our audience here. One final poll for the audience, so just a heads up, please do take the time to fill that out. And we will go into our Q&A. So we actually did receive several questions. Thank you, everyone, for being very patient for us to get into this. But I think I'll pull together a couple of questions here. But Stephen asked, how have you implemented a risk-based approach to vendor cyber risk assessments? That's one of the questions. And then secondly, have you delegated low, medium risk partner to sourcing to apply a risk-based assessment, or does this remain as part of InfoSec's responsibility?
Yeah, I can take a stab at the second one. I think that's what I referred to earlier, where I said, as much as possible, we ask our partners in procurement and other teams to absorb the list of standards that we've defined. So, for example, if in the procurement workflow we can identify certain vendors we are going to have a data sharing agreement with them, they go into this bucket. If it's a purely one unidirectional flow of data, they go into this bucket. And then it gives us the opportunity to set standards, right? If they're in this bucket, they must have a SOC 2 for us to do business. If you don't have a SOC 2, do not pass go, sorry. And I think as much as we can filter that down so that those decisions are just standards that are built into the tool, that helps a lot.
Great,
yeah, to piggyback on that somewhat, and I think Roman mentioned this a little bit as well, you have to have an understanding of what's going to matter from a security point of view at your company from an inherent risk standpoint, right? And that's going to be kind of your guiding light to making, you know, making the work and the effort actually matter, to Roman's point earlier. And hopefully you'll choose a solution that will take you through this, essentially, you know, making it can be an effortless process and can be very simple. And if you're on your own, you know, it takes a deep understanding of your own business model, its regulatory environment, the data that you handle, and the flows of data through your organization and other organizations. But hopefully you choose a solution that can help you do that very, very easily.
Right. Thank you. And I'll jump to another question just because we have several here. With so many subservice relationships, how far down the rabbit hole do we need to go for oversight of fourth, fifth, nth party risks and relationships?
So back to what is ideal, the answer would be as far down as necessary. In practice, that is going to be practically impossible. And that comes down to flow downs, contractual obligations. You know, can very large enterprises go audit providers of providers of providers? Some can, most can't and won't, right? And it's, are you perpetuating the, well, fill out this checklist and I'll assume that everything you say is right? Or do you just hold your providers accountable for what they do? And that is not a trivial problem to solve. But the reality is, right, that you really can't, there are very few places that can afford to go down those rabbit holes technically to do those assessments themselves. You know, how do you solve that? Well, you hold your vendors accountable to say, show me you did the due diligence. and you start there rather than trying to take that on yourself. And if the vendors can't, well, then you might want to question your risk tolerance and your risk basis with them.
I love that answer. I call out too, one thing I've done that's been successful in the past at companies that are producing products that are public facing is start with service delivery and map back to critical components of those services, and then align the vendor inventory. I'm sure we know that we need to build an asset inventory, but a lot of those assets are not ours anymore. They're a vendor asset. So making sure people understand that we were contractually committed to deliver this service to a customer. To do that, we need these vendors working. If AWS goes down and we're only on AWS, then that's the answer right there.
Absolutely. Thank you both for that. Another question kind of popped up, which is obviously the current economic environment is very different from how it was the last couple of years going into 2023. Are you kind of approaching your security strategy or TPRM strategy differently, given some of the challenges economically speaking that are propping up? I know that's kind of a sort of bigger question and, but perfect question to ask my CISO leaders here.
Well, Jenny, I can give you some information on kind of what we're seeing. So we're seeing essentially, two things. One, we see companies increasingly reliant on third parties, which, that's just kind of adding more fuel on an enormous bonfire that's probably never going to get any smaller, only going to get larger. But we also, there are teams that are under-resourced, right? And in the current economic climate, most companies aren't running out to, add a whole bunch more third-party security risk analysts, right? And so there's that much more need for automation and solutions that, like what customers have achieved with our platform, where you can essentially, 10x the productivity of those analysts. And so anyway, that's kind of what we're seeing is those two things: more reliance on third parties and teams under more pressure and less resources.
Thank you, Paul. Anything to add to that, Roman or Terry?
I sure thought that this year would be the year that we got serious about open source governance because of the Log4j vulnerability, but I haven't seen a lot of appetite to really invest there. So that's one thing I was hoping for, but I'm not seeing in the current climate.
Great, thanks for that. So I know that we are almost at the top of the hour. I know that there are other questions we have not answered, but we will make sure to respond, follow up via email with our answers from the panelists or from the Viso Trust team. So do keep an eye out for that. I just wanted to say thank you so much for the panelists here who took their time out of their day to join us and to talk about third-party risk and shifting it left and other innovations and strategies that we should be considering. I hope this was helpful to the audience. I've seen a ton of engagement, so thank you so much. Feel free to connect with Paul, Terry, and Roman here. We have their LinkedIn pages QR coded, and we also will be sending out a copy of this webinar. So definitely we will keep in touch, and thank you so much for your time today.